Ethan Blake walked through the airport terminal with the measured pace of someone who had been here countless times before. The polished floor reflected the soft click of his leather shoes, a rhythm steady enough to blend into the background hum of hurried travelers. Overhead, flight announcements punctuated the air, competing with snippets of conversation and the occasional laughter of children too young to care about time zones or boarding gates. He adjusted the strap of his well-worn leather briefcase, a gift from his wife, Mariah, on their 5th anniversary. It had seen better days, but replacing it never felt right. Some things, like the comforting weight of a familiar story, were worth holding on to. Inside were the tools of his trade, a laptop, a handful of contracts, and a book he'd been trying to finish for weeks. The latter had become a reluctant companion on these trips, its pages a retreat from the constant pull of his phone's notifications. Ethan's thoughts flickered to home, to Jacob, his 7-year-old son, who had likely spent breakfast explaining some new science experiment, and Sophia, his 4-year-old daughter, who was never without an elaborate tale of princesses and fairies. Mariah had sent a picture earlier, Jacob attempting to braid Sophia's hair while she beamed with the confidence only a child could muster. His smile, faint but warm, lingered as he neared the first-class lounge. The attendant at the desk greeted him with a practiced, professional smile. Her eyes brightened with recognition. "Good morning, Mr. Blake," she said, scanning his boarding pass. "In 2A again today?" He nodded. "That's right, thanks, Clara." These small acknowledgments, the quiet familiarity of being remembered, mattered more to Ethan than he let on. It wasn't the coffee or the upgraded seating that kept him loyal to this airline, it was the brief, human moments in an otherwise mechanical process. Settling into a quiet corner of the lounge, he took out his phone to review emails, his eyes scanning a pitch deck from a young clean energy startup. Promising. The kind of project that aligned with the values he'd built his career on, turning not just profits but opportunities into meaningful change. These were the ventures that excited him, though they often reminded him how far he'd come. The memories were never far away, as vivid as the smell of summer heat in the neighborhood where he grew up. He'd been the boy with big dreams, the one who counted coins to buy his first tie, sitting in a library corner with borrowed books about economics. Back then, he couldn't have imagined himself here, dressed in a tailored suit, boarding a flight home from a meeting that might shape a new market. The announcement for priority boarding pulled him from his thoughts. He closed his phone, gathered his things, and made his way to the gate. The jet bridge stretched before him, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan paused. He wasn't afraid of flying, he had grown used to it. It was the ritual he'd perfected over years of business travel. Still, there was something about stepping onto a plane, a space suspended in the air, moving between destinations, that always felt slightly surreal. The flight attendant at the door smiled warmly as she gestured toward the first-class cabin. Ethan returned her nod, his briefcase firm in his grip. The familiar sight of plush leather seats greeted him, along with the faint aroma of fresh coffee. He stowed his bag, feeling the weight of his success settle around him like a well-fitted coat. Sliding into seat 2A, he allowed himself a moment to exhale. The routine comforted him, but even here, even now, he couldn't fully let his guard down. There was an unspoken vigilance that accompanied his presence in these spaces, a quiet awareness of being noticed. Ethan opened the biography he'd brought with him, the story of a pioneering mathematician who had carved her place in history with grace and grit. He let the steady hum of boarding passengers fill the silence around him. Across the aisle, a man glanced his way, quickly enough to feign disinterest but lingering long enough to make his discomfort plain. Ethan knew the look. He kept his attention on the page before him, his posture easy but deliberate. Years of experience had taught him how to navigate these moments, not with anger that was a battle lost before it began, but with quiet certainty. He belonged here, whether they realized it or not. As the cabin filled, snippets of conversation floated through the air, blending with the sounds of rolling luggage and rustling papers. Ethan absorbed it all without looking up. He had learned long ago that the loudest moments often came in whispers. When the flight attendant approached to offer a pre-flight drink, Ethan ordered sparkling water with lime. Her smile was polite, her service efficient, Yet he noticed the slightest hesitation in her tone. The subtle double check of his seat number. The moments were small, imperceptible to most, but Ethan felt them all, like ripples in an otherwise calm sea. The boarding door closed, and the engines hummed to life. Ethan leaned back into his seat, gazing out the window as the plane taxied toward the runway. Beyond the glass, the world stretched out in shades of blue and gold, the rising sun painting the horizon. As the plane lifted into the sky, Ethan felt the weight of the earth fall away. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe in the clarity of the view from above, where everything seemed simple and free. But even here, among the clouds, the world's complexities traveled with him. There were always questions, sometimes silent, sometimes spoken, but today was no different. The answers, however, would come soon enough. The plane had just begun its steady ascent when the first sign of trouble appeared. Ethan Blake noticed it before anyone else, a man standing in the aisle, boarding pass in hand, his brow furrowed as he scanned the seat numbers. The man was tall, his gray temples sharply contrasting his expensive navy suit. He glanced down at his ticket, then up at the overhead markers, his lips tightening into a thin line. Ethan didn't think much of it at first. People mixed up their seats all the time. Flying could be disorienting, but there was something about the man's posture. The way his eyes flicked toward Ethan's seat 2A and lingered just a moment too long. The man seemed to be wrestling with something, a thought or assumption that hadn't quite made its way to his lips yet. "Excuse me," the man said suddenly, his voice carrying an edge of authority. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the low hum of conversation in the cabin. A flight attendant, Emily, her name tag read, approached him with a practiced smile. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her tone smooth and professional. "I believe there's been some confusion with the seating," the man said, gesturing vaguely in Ethan's direction. His voice carried a distinct air of confidence, as though he were accustomed to his concerns being addressed immediately. Emily glanced between the man's boarding pass and the row numbers, her smile faltering ever so slightly. "Let me check that for you," she said. Ethan lowered his book just enough to watch the exchange. He wasn't surprised, he'd been here before. Different circumstances, same undertone. It was the kind of moment that carried an unspoken weight, like a storm cloud just beginning to form. He placed a finger on the edge of his page, marking his place, but said nothing. The man shifted his attention directly to Ethan. His expression was polite, but there was a certain tightness around his mouth, a stiffness in his stance. "Sir," the man began, his tone teetering between condescension and forced civility, "I think you may have accidentally taken the wrong seat. This is first class." Ethan blinked once, slowly, and closed his book. He looked up, his gaze steady but neutral. "This is my assigned seat," he said calmly, his voice low but firm. The man's brows knit together, as though Ethan's response didn't quite fit into the narrative he'd constructed. "Are you sure?" he pressed. "These things happen sometimes. Easy to mix up coach with first class when boarding." The words hung in the air, a quiet challenge wrapped in feigned politeness. Around them, conversations began to die down. A few passengers pretended to remain absorbed in their magazines or screens. But Ethan could feel their attention shifting toward the brewing confrontation. Emily stepped in quickly, her voice carefully measured. "Let me verify the boarding pass." Just to be sure, Ethan handed her his pass without hesitation. His movements were deliberate, controlled, the way they always were in situations like this. He had nothing to prove, but he understood the unspoken rules of these encounters. Staying calm wasn't just about maintaining his dignity, it was about disarming the assumptions that others brought into the room. Or in this case, the cabin. Emily studied the boarding pass, her professional demeanor slipping just slightly into something more apologetic. "Everything checks out, Mr. Blake," she said. "This is your seat." The man's face flushed, a faint but unmistakable shade of red creeping up his neck. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "I suppose mistakes can happen. Standards aren't what they used to be." Ethan didn't respond. He simply inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement that conveyed neither agreement nor anger. It was a skill he'd honed over the years, a way to navigate these moments without giving them more oxygen than they deserved. Emily guided the man to his seat a few rows back. her heels clicking softly against the carpet. But the tension didn't leave the cabin. It lingered, like a ripple spreading across still water. Ethan could feel it in the way passengers avoided his gaze. In the two quick glances from those pretending not to watch. He could feel it in the silence that followed. Heavy and awkward, as though the air itself had grown denser. Ethan reopened his book, but the words on the page blurred together. Katherine Johnson's story, one of perseverance and brilliance, felt particularly relevant now. She had faced greater obstacles. He reminded himself. She had persisted, not by confronting every slight head-on, but by letting her work speak louder than the noise around her. Still, the weight of the moment pressed against his chest. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something quieter, heavier, a tired recognition of how familiar this all was. The setting might have changed, the plush leather seat, the complimentary sparkling water, but the script remained the same. Across the aisle, an older woman, Margaret Taylor, he remembered from the boarding list, stole a glance at him. Her hands gripped the armrests of her seat. Her knuckles white. She looked as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Ethan met her gaze briefly. Offering a faint smile, she looked away. Her expression conflicted. The plane leveled out, cruising smoothly above the clouds. Outside, the world stretched in endless shades of blue and white, serene and indifferent. But inside the cabin, the unspoken tension lingered, a quiet reminder of how small moments could carry the weight of something much larger. Ethan turned another page, though he wasn't reading. Instead, he let his eyes drift over the text, allowing the hum of the engines to fill the silence. It wasn't the first time he'd been here, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. The cabin had settled into a practiced rhythm. The faint rustle of newspapers, the gentle clink of glasses, and the occasional cough created a familiar symphony of quiet activity. For most passengers, this was just another flight, a brief pause between destinations. But for Ethan Blake, the weight of the earlier encounter lingered, like a shadow that refused to dissipate. He kept his gaze fixed on the book in his hands, though he wasn't truly reading. The biography of Katherine Johnson sat open to a chapter detailing her triumphs at NASA. The words blurred slightly, replaced by the memory of the man's voice, calm, assured, yet cutting. This is first class. As if the seat itself demanded a higher proof of belonging than the ticket he held. Ethan turned the page, the paper smooth under his fingertips. Years of experience had taught him to remain composed, to let the noise pass without taking root. But it was harder today. There was something about the man's casual dismissal, the way his assumptions had unfolded so effortlessly, that left Ethan with a quiet sense of fatigue. He adjusted his posture, leaning slightly toward the window. Outside, the world below was reduced to patches of land and sky, a quilt of muted colors stretching into the horizon. Up here, above it all, everything seemed simpler, but Ethan knew better. The complexity of the world, its tensions, its unspoken hierarchies traveled with you, no matter how high you climbed. Across the aisle, Margaret Taylor, the elderly woman who had glanced at him earlier, fidgeted with her book. Her movements were slow and deliberate, the kind of small gestures that spoke of a mind elsewhere. She seemed to be avoiding his direction, though her body language betrayed her unease. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned a page, her focus more on the act than the content. Ethan didn't blame her. He knew the feeling, the internal struggle between wanting to do something and the paralyzing fear of doing the wrong thing. Her silence wasn't hostility, it was uncertainty. And that, in its own way, was just as telling. A flight attendant, Emily, passed by his seat, her professional demeanor slightly strained. She offered him a brief smile, one that carried both an apology and an unspoken question. "Are you all right?" Ethan returned the smile with a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that he understood. She had done her job. After all, he didn't fault her for the way the moment had unfolded. If anything, he pitied the delicate tightrope she walked. He closed the book, letting it rest in his lap. The biography, a testament to resilience, had once inspired him to push through moments like this. But today, it felt more like a mirror, reflecting the quiet battles he fought daily. Katherine Johnson had faced her challenges with grace, letting her brilliance speak for itself. But Ethan couldn't help but wonder, why was grace always the expectation? Why was dignity something he had to perform, rather than simply possess? The seatbelt sign dinged off, and a few passengers began to rise, stretching or making their way to the restroom. Ethan remained seated, his hands resting on the edges of the armrests. Movement, he knew, invited scrutiny, and though he had every right to exist in this space, he was acutely aware of the eyes that might follow him if he did. Margaret's book slipped from her lap, sliding across the aisle. Instinctively, Ethan bent to pick it up, the smooth leather cover cool against his fingers. He handed it back to her with a polite smile. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying the faint drawl of the South. She hesitated, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was something in her expression, a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity, that gave her pause. "I seem to be all thumbs today." "It happens," Ethan replied evenly. His tone was light, offering her an easy out. He'd learned to do that. To make people feel comfortable even when the discomfort wasn't his to fix. She smiled faintly and opened her book again. Though she didn't turn the page, her fingers tapped lightly against the cover, a subtle rhythm that betrayed her restless thoughts. From a few rows back, the man Walter Hensley, Ethan had overheard his name during boarding, cleared his throat. The sound was loud, deliberate. It carried through the cabin like a pebble dropped into still water, disrupting the fragile quiet. "These flights," Walter said, his voice pitched just high enough to be heard, "used to have standards. People knew their place." Ethan felt the words land, their weight pressing into his chest. He didn't look up, didn't give Walter the satisfaction of acknowledgement. But he saw Margaret shift uncomfortably in her seat, her hands tightening around her book. A young couple a few rows ahead exchanged glances, their postures stiff. Emily, stationed at the front of the cabin, glanced back, her expression carefully neutral. The other passengers, business travelers, retirees, a scattering of younger professionals, pretended not to hear. But Ethan could feel the tension ripple outward, silent and pervasive. He exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing against the armrest. These moments were a test, one he had taken many times before. The goal wasn't to win, it was to endure. To exist in the space without letting it shrink around him. The plane's engines hummed steadily, a reminder of the distance between this temporary conflict and the world below. Ethan thought of Jacob and Sophia, of the questions they would one day ask. Why does this happen? Why do people treat us differently? He didn't yet know how he would answer. But he knew he wanted his children to see strength, not resignation, resilience, not retreat. Walter muttered something else, but Ethan didn't catch the words. He didn't need to. The meaning was clear enough. Margaret glanced at him again, her lips pressing into a thin line. She looked as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the courage. Ethan met her gaze briefly, offering her the same calm smile as before. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jostling the cabin. Margaret's book slipped again, but this time, she caught it. Her knuckles were white against the edges of the cover. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked gently. She nodded, her smile tight. "Fine, thank you. Just not used to flying much these days." Ethan nodded, letting the conversation drop. There was no need to push. Sometimes, silence carried its own kind of understanding. The cabin settled again, the tension still palpable but quieter now. Ethan opened his book, determined to read this time. The words felt heavier than before, each one a reminder of the battles fought by those who had come before him. The battles he still fought, in quieter, subtler ways. Outside, the clouds drifted by, indifferent to the drama unfolding thousands of feet above the earth. Ethan let his gaze linger on them for a moment, their peaceful movement a stark contrast to the storm brewing within the cabin. He turned another page, his resolve steady, even as the weight of it all pressed against him. The turbulence passed, leaving behind a quiet that felt heavier than before. Outside the window, the horizon stretched endlessly, clouds rolling beneath the plane like a sea of cotton. Inside, however, the air felt taut, as if the earlier exchange had tightened an invisible thread between the passengers. Ethan Blake kept his focus on the book in his lap. Though he hadn't turned a page in several minutes, he could feel the weight of eyes on him, not openly staring, but darting glances, cautious and uncertain. It was a familiar sensation, like sitting under a spotlight that only he could see. Across the aisle, Margaret Taylor fidgeted with her reading glasses. She opened and closed her book several times, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted it on her lap. Her movements were deliberate, almost exaggerated, as if each action carried a hidden purpose. It was clear she wanted to say something, but the words were stuck somewhere between thought and action. Finally, her voice broke the silence. Soft but clear. "That's an interesting book you're reading." Ethan looked up, his expression calm but curious. "It is," he replied. "A biography of Katherine Johnson. She was one of the mathematicians who helped get us to the moon." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her curiosity genuine. "The NASA mathematician, right? I think I saw something about her on television. Quite a remarkable woman." "She was," Ethan said. "Her calculations were critical to the Apollo missions. But more than that, she broke barriers in a place where people didn't think she belonged." Margaret hesitated, her gaze flickering toward her hands. "That must have been a lot to carry." Ethan nodded slowly. "It was. But she did it anyway." Margaret seemed to weigh his words carefully. Her silence was not dismissive, but contemplative, as though she were examining something about herself as much as the subject of their conversation. The plane leveled off, and a flight attendant began moving through the aisle with a drink cart. Margaret's book slipped from her lap again, tumbling onto the floor with a soft thud. Before she could react, Ethan reached down and retrieved it, placing it gently back on her tray table. "Thank you," she said quietly, her cheeks coloring slightly. "I seem to be all thumbs today." "No trouble," Ethan replied with a small smile. "It happens." Margaret's eyes lingered on him for a moment. "You know," she began, her tone hesitant, "I'm embarrassed to say I've never really thought about what someone like Katherine Johnson must have gone through. I mean, all those barriers. It's hard to imagine. It's not just history," Ethan said, his voice even. "Some of those barriers are still around. They just look different now." Margaret's expression shifted, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. "I suppose that's true," she admitted. "I guess I've been lucky not to see it up close." Her honesty hung in the air, unpolished but sincere. It was the kind of admission Ethan had heard before, from people who meant well but struggled to reconcile their worldview with the realities of others. He appreciated the effort, even if it came late. The man from earlier, Walter Hensley, shifted in his seat behind them. Though his movements were subtle, the tension in his posture was unmistakable. He wasn't part of the conversation, but his presence loomed, a silent reminder of the confrontation that had set the tone for the flight. Margaret glanced toward him briefly before returning her attention to Ethan. "You must have worked very hard to get where you are," she said softly. "I have," Ethan replied simply. "But sometimes, hard work isn't enough. Sometimes, you have to work harder just to get to the same place as everyone else." Her brow furrowed slightly, her lips pressing together. "That doesn't seem fair." "It isn't," Ethan said, "but it's reality." Margaret nodded, her eyes distant. She looked out the window for a moment, as though searching for something in the endless expanse of sky. "My husband used to say the world isn't fair, but we can always try to be." Ethan's smile softened. "He sounds like a wise man." She gave a small laugh, though it carried a hint of sadness. "He was. Henry always believed in treating people with kindness. No matter what. Said it was the least we could do." Ethan considered her words, the sincerity behind them. "Kindness goes a long way," he said, "but understanding goes further." The drink cart reached their row, and the flight attendant paused, offering sparkling water to Ethan and tea to Margaret. Her movements were quick, efficient, but her smile lingered on Ethan a little longer than usual, a silent acknowledgement of the earlier tension. Margaret took a sip of her tea, her fingers still trembling slightly as they wrapped around the cup. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said after a moment. "How we can all be in the same space, flying thousands of feet above the ground, and yet feel so far apart." "It is," Ethan agreed, "but it doesn't have to stay that way." Margaret's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her gaze. "No," she said softly. "I suppose it doesn't." The conversation shifted then, flowing into safer, more familiar territory. Margaret spoke of her grandchildren, their mischief and curiosity. Ethan shared stories about Jacob and Sophia, their boundless energy and endless questions about the world. They found common ground in these small, personal moments, proof that connection was possible, even across the divides of experience and understanding. Walter remained silent, his presence a faint hum in the background. But the air in the cabin felt lighter now, the tension that had settled over them slowly unraveling. Outside, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the clouds. Ethan looked out at the expanse, his thoughts drifting to his family waiting for him at home. This flight, like so many others, was just a small part of his journey. But perhaps, in these quiet exchanges, in the gentle breaking of silences, something meaningful had begun. The sun began its slow descent, its warm light streaming through the cabin windows and softening the sharp edges of the day. For a moment, it bathed the passengers in a shared glow, as though inviting them to forget the tensions and boundaries that had marked the flight. But the quiet divisions lingered, unspoken yet present, woven into the fabric of the space. Ethan Blake leaned back in his seat, his hands resting lightly on the closed book in his lap. Across the aisle, Margaret Taylor sipped her tea thoughtfully, her eyes darting to him now and then, as if still considering their earlier conversation. Around them, the cabin buzzed with subdued activity, the click of laptops, the shuffle of newspapers, the soft murmur of voices carrying half-finished thoughts. The quiet between Ethan and Margaret was broken by a voice from a few rows ahead. "I couldn't help but overhear," a man said, leaning slightly over the aisle. His gray suit was crisply pressed, his tie impeccably knotted. "You mentioned clean energy earlier. Are you in that field?" Ethan glanced up, his expression neutral but polite. "I am," he said. "I work in investments, focusing on startups in clean technology and sustainable solutions." The man nodded, his interest genuine. "Impressive. I'm Gregory Carter. My firm has been exploring opportunities in renewable energy. It's the way forward, no doubt about it." "Nice to meet you," Ethan replied, extending a hand across the aisle. "Ethan Blake." Margaret watched the exchange quietly, her tea forgotten for the moment. There was a slight shift in her posture, a softening, as if seeing Ethan in this context made something click for her, a realization of the depth and scope of his work. Gregory continued, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone used to networking. "What kind of projects are you focused on, if you don't mind my asking?" "Right now, we're working with a solar tech company aiming to reduce installation costs by 40%. Ethan said, "The goal is to make renewable energy more accessible to underserved communities." Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly. 40%? That's quite a reduction. "It is," Ethan said. "If we can make clean energy affordable for more people, it's not just an environmental win, it's an economic one too. Lower energy costs can change a lot for families trying to make ends meet." Gregory nodded enthusiastically. "That's a game changer. My team's been trying to figure out how to balance profitability with impact." "Sounds like you found a way to do both." Ethan's lips curved into a small smile. "It's not easy, but it's worth the effort." The conversation began to draw in other passengers. A young woman in a tech company hoodie turned in her seat. Her curiosity piqued. "Are you Ethan Blake from Blake Investments?" she asked, her voice hesitant but excited. "I am," Ethan said, inclining his head slightly. Her face lit up. "I read about your firm in Tech Weekly. You're behind that AI education platform for schools, right?" "One of our projects," Ethan said. "We've been working to level the playing field in STEM education, especially in rural and underserved areas." "That's incredible," she said. "I teach coding to middle schoolers on the weekends. What you're doing, it's inspiring." Margaret, who had been listening intently, placed her cup on her tray table. "You've done a lot," she said, her voice thoughtful, "but you don't seem the type to talk about it much." "I try to let the work speak for itself," Ethan replied. Margaret's gaze lingered on him for a moment. "That's admirable," she said, "though I can't help but wonder, why should you have to?" The question hung in the air, unexpected but pointed. Ethan met her eyes, his expression steady. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "success is the only way to change the narrative." From behind them, Walter Hensley shifted audibly in his seat. His earlier discomfort had given way to a forced air of politeness. But his posture remained stiff. His movements deliberate. He cleared his throat, leaning slightly forward. "You've certainly achieved a lot," Walter said, his voice strained but measured. "It's commendable." Ethan turned slightly, acknowledging the comment with a nod. "Thank you." Walter hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "It's good to see someone using their success to make a difference," he added, his tone suggesting an effort to bridge the earlier divide. Ethan recognized the attempt for what it was: a small, imperfect step toward reconciliation. He didn't dismiss it, but neither did he overstate its importance. "Making a difference is the goal," he said simply. Margaret's gaze flicked between them, her expression unreadable. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost wistful. "My Henry used to say that real character shows when no one's looking. But sometimes, I think it shows even more when everyone is." Ethan smiled faintly. "Sounds like he was a wise man." "He was," she said, her eyes misting slightly. "And he would have appreciated your grace today." The warmth in her words touched something in Ethan. A reminder that not every encounter was a battle. Some moments, like this one, carried the potential for understanding. However small. The sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow across the cabin. The tension that had marked the earlier part of the flight seemed to dissolve, replaced by a quiet sense of connection. Conversations flowed more easily now, spanning topics from family to business to the small joys of travel. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his book resting once again in his lap. The clouds outside shifted, their shapes softened by the fading light. He let his gaze linger on them, his thoughts drifting to home. There was still work to be done, always work to be done. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace. A quiet victory in the unlikeliest of places. The plane moved steadily through the sky, cruising at 30,000 feet. Outside, the horizon burned with the last hues of sunset, the golden light stretching across the clouds like a quiet promise of a new day. Inside the cabin, however, the quiet held a different weight, thicker, layered with thoughts unspoken. Ethan Blake sat in his seat, his book now closed and resting on the tray table. He wasn't reading anymore. Instead, he let his thoughts wander, reflecting on the unexpected turn this flight had taken. It was supposed to be a simple journey home, a chance to recharge, to return to Mariah and the kids. But as often happened, life had other plans. Across the aisle, Margaret Taylor was writing something in the notebook she'd pulled from her bag. Her pen moved deliberately, as though each word required careful thought. Occasionally, she glanced in Ethan's direction, her expression thoughtful, even pensive. Behind them, Walter Hensley sat stiffly in his seat, his earlier bravado now subdued. The silence from his corner felt loud, a kind of tension born from unspoken apologies and unacknowledged regret. He hadn't said much since his attempt to offer Ethan a compliment. Perhaps he was still grappling with the gap between his assumptions and reality. The shift in the cabin's atmosphere was subtle but unmistakable. Conversations had softened, the hum of idle chatter replaced by something quieter, more contemplative. Passengers who had earlier avoided Ethan's gaze now seemed more willing to meet his eyes, though always with a hint of hesitation. Margaret broke the silence between them. "You mentioned earlier that your company works in education," she said, her voice tentative but genuine. "What inspired you to focus on that?" Ethan glanced at her, his expression softening. "My kids," he said simply. "Jacob and Sophia. They're young, but they're already so curious about the world. I want them to have every opportunity to grow into that curiosity, no matter where life takes them." Margaret nodded slowly, her pen hovering above the notebook. "It's good work," she said. "Important work. My granddaughter wants to be a teacher. I think about the world she'll grow up in and wonder if it'll be kinder than the one I knew." "It can be," Ethan said, his tone even, "but it takes effort. From all of us." She hesitated, then lowered her pen. "I didn't speak up earlier," she admitted. When things happened. I wanted to, but I didn't. I suppose I was afraid of saying the wrong thing." Ethan regarded her carefully, his expression unreadable. "Speaking up isn't easy," he said after a moment. It's uncomfortable, and it carries risks. But silence carries its own cost. Margaret met his gaze, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then she gave a small nod, as though acknowledging a truth she had long avoided. Henry used to say that, too, she murmured. That silence is its own kind of decision. Ethan leaned back in his seat, letting her words settle. He thought about the times in his own life when silence had spoken louder than words, moments when prejudice was unchallenged. Not out of malice but out of fear or convenience. Those moments had shaped him, just as much as the overt acts of discrimination he'd faced. From the row ahead, Gregory Carter turned in his seat. "Ethan," he said, his voice carrying the easy warmth of someone who had found an opening in the conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier about balancing profitability with impact. How do you convince investors to take the leap?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "It's not about convincing," he said. "It's about showing them the bigger picture. Profit is important, yes, but long-term success comes from creating value not just for shareholders, but for communities. When people see the impact, they're more willing to invest in something that lasts." Gregory nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's a perspective we could use more of in my industry." The young woman in the hoodie, Emma, she'd introduced herself earlier, joined in. "It's refreshing to hear someone in your position talk about sustainability and equity. Usually, it's just buzzwords, but you seem to mean it." "I do," Ethan said simply, "because I've seen what happens when those things are missing. And I've seen what's possible when they're present." Walter shifted again, the sound of his movement drawing brief attention. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of its earlier condescension. "You've done well for yourself," he said. "More than well. It's admirable." Ethan didn't reply immediately. He let the words sit, acknowledging them without accepting them fully. "Success isn't just about what you achieve," he said finally. "It's about what you do with it." Margaret glanced between them, her expression thoughtful. "And you've done plenty," she said softly. "More than most." "It's a start," Ethan said, "but there's always more to do." The conversation drifted then, moving into safer topics: favorite books, travel stories, and shared reflections on the beauty of the sunset outside. The earlier tension in the cabin had eased, replaced by something quieter, more introspective. Yet even in this calmer space, the undercurrents of the day's events remained. Ethan felt it in the way Margaret's voice softened when she spoke to him, as though she were trying to make up for her earlier silence. He felt it in Walter's stilted attempts at conversation, each one tinged with the weight of unspoken apologies. And he felt it in himself, the quiet resolve that had carried him through countless moments like this. As the plane began its descent, the world outside transformed into a patchwork of city lights and darkened landscapes. The glow from the horizon faded, giving way to the quiet promise of night. Inside the cabin, passengers shifted in their seats, gathering their belongings and preparing for the end of the journey. Margaret turned to Ethan one last time. "I hope your kids know how lucky they are," she said, "to have a father who's building a better world for them." Ethan smiled faintly, his expression tinged with both gratitude and weariness. "I just want them to grow up in a world where they don't have to prove they belong." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, there was nothing more to say. The plane dipped lower, the hum of the engines a steady reminder of the journey's nearing end. But for Ethan, the real journey was far from over. The plane began its descent, tilting slightly as it aligned with the runway below. Outside, the city stretched out in a web of golden lights, a quiet counterpoint to the darkening sky. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had settled into an uneasy quiet, marked by the soft shuffle of passengers preparing for landing. Yet beneath the surface, currents of reflection and unspoken acknowledgement moved between them. Ethan Blake gazed out the window, his thoughts drifting. The familiar skyline of his city came into view, a welcome reminder of home, of Mariah and the kids waiting with open arms. But even with the thought of them grounding him, his mind lingered on the flight, on what had been said, and what had not. Across the aisle, Margaret Taylor was neatly folding her notebook, the act more deliberate than necessary. She glanced at Ethan, her expression a mixture of resolve and lingering regret. "Mr. Blake," she began hesitantly, her voice softened by the hum of the engines. I just want to say, thank you. Ethan turned to her, his expression patient but curious. For what? For handling all of this with grace, she said, gesturing vaguely toward the cabin, as though the atmosphere itself was part of what she meant. I don't know if I could have. He offered a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Sometimes grace is a choice, he said, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Margaret nodded slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of her notebook. I've been thinking about what you said earlier about silence. You were right. Staying quiet doesn't make things better. It just lets them stay the same. Ethan tilted his head slightly, acknowledging her words without pressing her further. He knew that moments like this, small admissions, private reckonings, were steps. Imperfect, yes, but steps all the same. Behind them, Walter Hensley stirred in his seat. For much of the descent, he had been uncharacteristically quiet, his earlier confidence replaced by a subdued demeanor. He cleared his throat now, the sound drawing brief attention from Margaret and Ethan. Mr. Blake, Walter said, his tone carefully measured, I owe you an apology. For earlier, I made assumptions that I shouldn't have. Ethan regarded him calmly, his expression unreadable. He'd heard apologies like this before, some genuine, others laced with obligation or discomfort. This one fell somewhere in between, weighed down by the awkwardness of a man unused to admitting fault. I appreciate that, Ethan said evenly, neither dismissing the gesture nor overly embracing it. He knew better than to expect more than what was offered. Walter hesitated, then added, I didn't realize who you were. The words hung in the air, their meaning clear. I didn't realize you were successful. Important, worth respecting. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. Would it have mattered? Walter opened his mouth, then closed it again, the question striking with quiet precision. After a moment, he shook his head, his shoulders slumping slightly. No, he said finally, though his tone suggested that answer was as much for himself as it was for Ethan. Margaret glanced between the two men, her expression thoughtful but restrained. Ethan could see the questions forming behind her eyes, the kind she wouldn't ask now, but might carry with her long after the flight. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the final preparations for landing began. Passengers adjusted their seats and secured their belongings. The shared ritual of descent a temporary distraction from deeper thoughts. Ethan tucked his book into his briefcase, his movements steady despite the weight of the moment. As the plane touched down, a gentle shudder ran through the cabin, breaking the stillness. The runway lights flickered past the windows, their steady rhythm marking the transition from air to ground. Around him, passengers began to stir, their voices rising in anticipation of arrival. Margaret leaned toward him as they taxied to the gate. You've given me a lot to think about, she said quietly. I can't change the past, but maybe I can do better moving forward. Ethan met her gaze, his expression softening. That's all any of us can do. The plane came to a stop, and the cabin filled with the familiar sounds of unbuckling seatbelts and rustling bags. Margaret stood slowly, her movements deliberate as she gathered her things. She hesitated for a moment, then extended her hand to Ethan. Safe travels, Mr. Blake, she said. And to you, Mrs. Taylor, he replied, shaking her hand with quiet warmth. As he stood to retrieve his bag from the overhead compartment, Ethan noticed Walter lingering nearby, his posture awkward but his expression earnest. For a moment, it seemed as though he might say something more, but instead, he gave a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that carried more weight than words could. Ethan nodded back, accepting the gesture for what it was. Small steps, he reminded himself. Change didn't happen all at once. As he made his way down the aisle, he caught snippets of whispered conversations. A few passengers who had overheard the earlier exchanges offered him polite smiles or quiet nods. Others avoided his gaze entirely, their expressions unreadable. It was a mix he had come to expect: curiosity, respect, discomfort, all woven together in the tapestry of human interaction. At the exit, the flight attendant Emily paused as he approached. Mr. Blake, she said softly, her voice carrying a note of sincerity. Thank you for your patience today. I'll do better next time. Ethan offered her a small smile. That's all I can ask. Stepping into the jet bridge, He felt the cool rush of air from the terminal. A welcome contrast to the charged atmosphere of the cabin. The weight of the flight lingered on his shoulders. But with it came a quiet resolve, a reminder of the work still ahead. As he walked toward the terminal, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Mariah. "We're waiting for you. The kids are excited to see Daddy." He smiled. The thought of home washing over him like a bomb. This was why he endured. For them. For the world he hoped they would inherit. And as the lights of the terminal came into view, he straightened his shoulders, ready to carry the lessons of this flight into the days to come. The terminal was alive with its usual symphony of sound, rolling luggage, distant announcements, and murmured conversations that rose and fell like waves. Ethan Blake walked with purpose, his briefcase in one hand, the other tucked into his pocket. The air inside felt different now, lighter, less tense, yet the weight of the flight still lingered in the quiet corners of his thoughts. Ahead, through the sliding glass doors that led to the pickup area, he could see them, Mariah, Jacob, and Sophia. They stood beside the family car, framed by the glow of the overhead lights. Jacob held one end of a handmade sign that read, "Welcome home, Dad." The lettering was uneven, and glitter clung stubbornly to the edges. Sophia clutched the other end, though it hung at an awkward angle as she shifted on her toes. Eager to spot him, Ethan slowed his steps, savoring the moment. These were the moments that anchored him, the ones that reminded him why he endured, why he navigated the complexities of the world with measured grace. Mariah saw him first, her face breaking into the smile he had fallen in love with years ago. She nudged Jacob, who immediately abandoned his post at the sign and took off running, his sneakers squeaking against the pavement. "Dad," Jacob shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the terminal. Ethan set down his briefcase just in time to catch his son in a tight embrace, lifting him off the ground. Jacob smelled of peanut butter and crayons, familiar and grounding. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said, his voice soft but full of warmth. "I missed you." Sophia followed close behind, her tiny legs pumping as she ran toward him with a squeal. "Daddy," she cried, her arms outstretched. Ethan crouched to meet her, pulling her into the hug. She pressed her cheek against his, babbling about princesses and fairies and something about glitter getting stuck in her hair. He chuckled, brushing her curls back gently. Mariah approached more slowly, watching the scene with quiet affection. When Ethan finally looked up, she stepped into his arms, wrapping him in the kind of hug that said everything words couldn't. "Rough flight?" she murmured, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "Eventful," he replied, his tone steady. "I'll tell you later." Mariah pulled back slightly, searching his eyes for more. But she didn't press. Instead, she cupped his cheek briefly before turning to usher the kids toward the car. As they loaded his briefcase into the trunk, Jacob chattered excitedly about a science project he was working on, while Sophia continued her animated tale of the glitter incident. Ethan listened, nodding and laughing in the right places. But his mind wandered back to the flight. The faces of the passengers came to him in fragments. Margaret's quiet resolution, Walter's reluctant apology, the tech enthusiast's admiration. It wasn't the first time Ethan had navigated such moments, these small, fraught interactions that revealed as much about the world as they did about the people in it. But something about this one felt different. Perhaps it was the conversations left unfinished or the subtle shifts he had witnessed, like cracks forming in old walls. As Mariah started the car, Ethan glanced out the window, the terminal fading behind them. He thought of what he would tell Jacob and Sophia when they were older, when their innocent questions about the world became sharper, more complex. He would tell them the truth that success didn't erase prejudice, that it simply shifted its form. But he would also tell them about the moments that mattered, the times when grace and patience opened doors, when small conversations planted seeds of change. "Dad, did you see the sign?" Jacob asked suddenly, interrupting his thoughts. "I did," Ethan said, turning to his son with a smile. "You did a great job on it. The glitter really makes it stand out." Sophia beamed, clearly taking credit for the glitter. "I helped." Ethan laughed, reaching over to ruffle her hair. "Of course you did, princess." Mariah glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her eyes warm with understanding. "You're home now," she said simply. "Yeah," Ethan replied, leaning back in his seat. "I am." The car moved steadily down the road, the city lights fading into the soft shadows of their neighborhood. The familiar streets, the houses bathed in the glow of porch lights, it all felt like a balm. A reminder of what truly mattered. As they pulled into the driveway, Jacob and Sophia scrambled out of the car, racing to the front door. Mariah lingered for a moment, waiting for Ethan to gather his things. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "Whatever it was," she said softly, "you handled it. You always do." Ethan nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. One step at a time. Inside, the house was warm and alive, filled with the sounds of his children's laughter and the scent of the dinner Mariah had kept warm for him. Ethan set down his briefcase, pausing to take it all in. This was home. This was where he belonged, where no questions or assumptions could touch him. But even as he settled into the comfort of his family, he knew the world outside would still be waiting. The unspoken tensions, the quiet barriers, they would remain. Yet tonight, he allowed himself to rest, to let the weight of the flight fall away. Tomorrow would come, and with it, new challenges. But for now, he was simply a father, a husband, a man surrounded by love. And that, he thought, was enough.